Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody's having a wonderful beginning to the second week of the CSW. Everybody's seeing some great programs? Yes, really informative, opening our eyes to what's going on in all parts of the world. My name is Rabbi Diana Gerson. I am with the New York Board of Rabbis, and I am most privileged to be here with this incredible panel and with all of you. A couple of notes before we get started introducing everybody, a couple of housekeeping notes. Q&A, question and answer. We have placed index cards along the pews, and we'll also be walking around with them. If you have a question that comes to you, just write it down. We're going to come around and collect them so we can kind of group them together and we can answer more questions that way. Bathrooms are outside. And last but not least, we are videotaping this session. So if you are here and you don't want to be on video, please let us know. If you have a question, you don't want to be filmed, that's okay, just let us know. It is a stationary camera in the back of the room, so we will not be viewing the audience, so that for anybody who has any safety concerns at home. With that, welcome to Human Trafficking in America, looking at risks for women and girls in rural areas and collaborative prevention by faith-based communities. Every year, human trafficking, we know, is reported in all 50 states, not something we often think about in America. And we have some unique challenges because the United States is made up of such different and divergent communities. We have urban areas and suburban areas and rural communities. People don't often think of the US and they think, oh, New York, they think Washington, DC, maybe Chicago, Los Angeles, we all know. But the parts in between are what sometimes is really telling the big story about what's happening in America. So we are going to be exploring the unique aspects of this issue in America itself, of human trafficking, sex trafficking, labor trafficking, and impacts on women and girls specifically. I'm going to turn this over to Vivian Hugo, who joined the American Bar Association's Commission on Domestic and Sexual Violence as Chief Counsel in 2010. I am most privileged to know Vivian from when she was here in New York City working for the Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence. She is a tremendous resource and heads up also the task force on human trafficking. So she will give us a very unique perspective of what's going on around the country.
Thank you. Thanks so much, and thank you to our sponsors for hosting this important event. I think that this is a critical conversation because, as Diana mentioned, we often think of the big cities here in this country in terms of trafficking, but just an hour or maybe 2 hours outside some of those cities that she mentioned, there are rural areas that are facing unique and some similar challenges to what is being faced in urban areas across the country in terms of combating human trafficking. And so my role today is to talk about, I think, the bigger picture, what we're seeing and hearing about nationally. And then as we move through to the rest of my esteemed panel, we're going to hear about projects that are serving survivors that are in rural areas and some of the important work that's being done. So that we're all on the same page. The United States, of course, is a source country, a destination country. We have victims that are trafficked within, obviously, our borders and brought in to our borders throughout. Victims are men, women, adults, children. We're looking at both legal and illegal businesses and industries. And so the things that we routinely talk about, folks being exploited through sex trafficking, through prostitution, but also we're looking at agriculture, hospitality industry, other kinds of businesses and industries, mining industry. It runs the real range across the United States, just like across the United States, businesses and communities vary in terms of their local economies, and so trafficking also mirrors that local community and economy and finds its way there. What we're seeing in terms of the challenges for identifying victims of human trafficking in urban areas, it's very similar to rural areas, what we're hearing about from across the country, but it's exacerbated in a couple of ways, as you can imagine. We're seeing that a large percentage of counties that are identified as rural counties in this country, a large percentage of them have chronic and persistent poverty. And so that exacerbates a human trafficking problem to a large degree. It creates an additional community or population of highly vulnerable victims, potentially, of human trafficking. And then it also obviously taxes whatever service providers are in that community or near that community, in the sense of resources being stretched because of poverty, resources being limited that are being provided to the local service providers, right? So some of the challenges you can see are similar and some are going to be uniquely different. And so when I mention that local service providers that are nearby, well, what does nearby mean for some of these rural areas? And as Diana mentioned, it was quite shocking for me to move from practicing here in New York City to then working on in a more national way to understand some of the challenges that advocates, lawyers, law enforcement, and other folks are facing when they want to provide services to victims across the country. It's not quite the same thing as jumping on the subway and going to see your client in the borough next door. Folks are traveling hours upon hours to reach their clients, or in the other direction, a potential victim, if you can imagine, is facing the challenge of finding transportation and getting to a potential lawyer, a potential doctor, a potential minister, a potential advocate that is hours upon hours away. And so that challenge is incredibly hard to overcome if someone is already isolated, either because of poverty or because of the dynamics of trafficking, in that they have been purposefully isolated and kept from having a car or some kind of transportation. Public transportation is not as readily available in rural areas across this country as it is here. We've heard across the country about different projects that employ different kinds of technology, and those are great ideas. Those are fantastic, but we know that technology access is not uniform across the country, right? There are even spots in this city where you can't quite get cell service. Well, that's exacerbated to a large degree in certain large swaths of area across this country. Not everyone has access to a cell phone, and again, that might be because of poverty and not having access to it, or it could be intentional on the part of traffickers. So I want to just kind of lay a very brief snapshot for all of you to imagine that the challenges that you see in terms of identification of victims, in terms of their ability to access services, their ability to even come in contact with awareness campaigns, a lot of the steps that we are taking in a large number of urban areas to reach victims and survivors, those steps are made somewhat impossible by the geography of rural areas, some of the technology challenges that I mentioned. I know that those of us who have practiced and worked here in New York City often feel like our resources are often stretched thin because of the quantity of people that we're serving, but in rural areas, those resources are really stretched thin across very large areas of space. And so I just wanted to lay out kind of a general picture and then reserve some of my other comments for the Q&A and dig in a little bit deeper to what some of the recommendations might be. I want you to hear from folks about the detailed project work that is being done across the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. I think that we really understand that what happens in New York is very much different from what happens outside of our city, as well as it may have some things that overlap with what happens in other parts of the world, in more rural areas as well. We're going to next turn to Raleigh Sadler, Reverend Raleigh Sadler, who has been a minister and pastoring, and I think has really transformed his pastorate into a different modality as the founding director of Let My People Go, which is based in New York City and is a network of congregations across the country. We'll talk a little bit about his unique perspective in working in so many different areas. Raleigh.
Thank you. So I thought I was going to be a collegiate pastor for the rest of my life. That was what I trained for. That was really what I thought I was good at. And I found myself in West Virginia, which, coming from Florida, wasn't exactly where I thought I'd end up, but, you know, I was going for it. And it was here where I had to see some realities very clearly. One, I saw poverty. It was rampant. And I also saw isolation. Within the mountains, you have people who actually choose that isolation. And generally, when you have poverty and isolation, you're most likely going to have exploitation. And so as I was engaging this college where I was pretty much stationed, I started to realize some things. I was at a historically black college and university, and it was there where I had several bishops and different pastors who came alongside of me and said, we know that you understand what you are teaching, but how are you demonstrating that? What does it look like? And it was through this process that I would learn about human trafficking and realize that I needed to do something, but I didn't know if I had to go to college and get another degree, if I had to become a social worker, what did that mean? And ultimately, Let My People Go was born out of my wilderness experience in West Virginia, where I learned that the church and Christian faith communities can do something as we empower them to fight human trafficking by loving those most vulnerable. Because at the end of the day, traffickers will always target those who are most vulnerable. Whether their vulnerability is an unmet need, whether it's financial, it's social, it's material, or maybe their vulnerability is something where they didn't have the love that they craved growing up, and they're looking for that in a person. And so what we want to help faith communities realize is that by targeting vulnerable populations in a way that is, well, by targeting vulnerable populations in light of your own vulnerability as a human, you're able to love people that traffickers target in a way that is non-exploitative. And so that's ultimately what we do. And we work with churches in cities, we work with churches in rural communities, because what we can say is, no matter where you are, you have vulnerable populations. There are vulnerable people. I generally get this question, well, you have to understand, Raleigh, we don't have a highway system here. We're not near a major city. We don't have a problem with human trafficking. And I'm doing my best to not say something snarky. I'm trying at this point in my life. I'm getting older, and I'm learning that you can't just say snarky things when you feel them. Some of us haven't learned that yet. I'm learning it. I'm in process. But I'm just saying, you're right. You don't have a highway. That's absolutely true. But you know what you do have? Vulnerable people. And people are like, well, I guess. And I'm like, if there's someone without power, then there's going to be someone with power that wishes to exploit them. And the data is there. Most of those who traffic grow up in the same communities as those who are trafficked. And so what we're seeing, and there are several studies, and World Without Exploitation covers a lot of these studies in their most recent study release. But we're finding that it's not a stranger danger situation. It's someone you know or someone you've crossed paths with. And so what we're trying to tell churches is we need to respond to vulnerability in such a way that transforms our community. And we do this by partnering with churches, helping them develop a justice ministry team that leads the charge in this direction, helping that team do a community needs assessment where they learn who's most vulnerable. And in so doing, they're also not only learning who's most vulnerable in their community, they're learning who's already working with the vulnerable. So they're finding people in social services, local nonprofits, law enforcement, and they're able to create both a congregational as well as a collaborative local network. And it's through this that the church doesn't have to solve every problem. They just become a stop on the continuum of care. I had someone in Homeland Security say, we can do the physical rescue. We can do that. We can't do the spiritual guidance. We need you for that. And so really just through trial and error, we discovered that by addressing vulnerability, you're caring for those who could be trafficked, those who are trafficked, and those who have been trafficked. You're doing prevention, intervention, and aftercare all in one fell swoop. Thank you.
Wow, Raleigh, that's incredible. And I love the idea of having a justice ministry. I think I have a couple synagogues in mind where that would be a very useful tool. We don't often talk in terms of ministry development, but it's absolutely something I think every community, every congregation should think about. And certainly connecting with local social services, how incredibly important that is to create a social safety net underneath our communities. We're next going to turn to Rabbi Rachel Bregman. Rachel, whose work I have read and used for so long in my own work, in my own rabbinate, who I know started this work as a focal point when she was in Atlanta, Georgia at the Temple, which is actually a congregation I have also served. So it's a nice point of connection. But Rachel now lives and works in a community in Brunswick, Georgia, which is a very different kind of community than Atlanta. Atlanta is a very big hustle and bustle kind of urban area, whereas Brunswick, Georgia is a much more quiet beachfront community, if I remember correctly. And so her work has certainly transformed. And so I'm going to turn the microphone over to Rachel to please share with us her experience and her insights.
Thanks, Diana. So, can you hear me? It works better when it's on, it turns out. There we go. So we're gonna start right here. Who here walked in the room with somebody you already know? Very few of you. Terrific. That's what I was hoping for. So I have 6.5 minutes to talk to you, and I'm going to give 45 seconds of that time to all of you. I want you to please stop and take a second and introduce yourself to the person you're sitting next to who you don't already know, and then come right back to me. Just say hello, tell them who you are, and your favorite ice cream flavor.
I do exactly the same thing.
I love this. I love this.
That's awesome.
It's so great.
Well, I want to make your point.
She was chief of community affairs. I didn't want to bring her big gatherings, and she was COVID.
Okay, your time's up. I only have 5 minutes left. Come back. Okay, so I like building communities, and I think it's important, but that's not why I want you to say hello to one another. I want to pick up on Raleigh's point. We have vulnerable people in our society when we allow people to be invisible to one another. And so when you walk into a room, you have an opportunity to practice not letting people be invisible and therefore being objects. It's very easy to misuse objects because they're objects, right? So you walk into a room, say hi to people. I'm going to dare you to do something. I'm going to challenge all of you. I don't care if you live in a big city or a small town. We have at least 3 stoplights in Brunswick, Georgia, by the way, so don't tell me about the hustle and bustle. I want you to smile at people on the street. I know, you're in New York, and that's like the scariest thing in the world to do because they think you're up to something, but do it. And I don't mean that like fake, BS-y, maybe I ate something and feel funny kind of smile. I mean, I want you to really smile at the people you pass on the street as if you are seeing the face of God, because you are seeing the face of God. And they're seeing it back in you. And even if you don't believe that, you can be totally atheistic and still do this, okay? It still works. You're not exempt. Because even if you don't believe that, you can pretend it'll change the world. It will absolutely change the world because that person that you smile at in a way that is real and human will go on and smile at somebody else. Now, here's how this plays out in combating human trafficking, gun violence, racism, name your thing, is that we treat each other better. There was a subway prophet on my subway ride over here, and he got up and said something about how we need to respect each other more, and we'll treat each other better. And I think that's true. I think that's right. So that's why I wanted you to all say hello to each other, and I hope at the end you get to talk to one another a little bit more. So I want to tell you a little bit about myself beyond that I live in Brunswick, Georgia. I grew up with a foster sister. Her name was Gail. When we do visual things, I like to show a picture of her at 12 years old. She was so cute with like giant buck teeth, right? And she left our family, and ultimately her story is a sad one, and she ends up being trafficked out of the community I grew up in, which was the suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts. I grew up in Framingham. And ultimately, she was turning a trick, and the police officer who was newly, I'm sorry that it's a police officer, but this guy who was newly minted as a police officer didn't perform the task he was there to do, and she laughed at him, and he shot her. Right. So that's what trafficking can look like, because that was my sister, which is how I ultimately got into being involved in anti-human trafficking work. It was personal for me, but it's personal for all of us, right? Like Raleigh was saying, we all have moments in our lives where we're vulnerable. And if we haven't been exploited in our moments of vulnerability, then we're lucky. But usually people are in one way or another. So I, like Diana was saying, I went to Atlanta and I did a bunch of work there and pushed an initiative to educate about human trafficking happening in Atlanta, right? It's like one of the hotbed places in the country. And then I move out to the coast and I get there and I'm like, I'm gonna, fix human trafficking in Brunswick, Georgia, because I'm that girl, right? So, and I got there and I had become friendly with the state attorney general when I was in Atlanta, and I said to him, Sam Owens at the time, I said, tell me what's going on with trafficking in Brunswick. He's like, we're not prosecuting for it. He's like, it's not that it's not happening, we're just not prosecuting for it. So I asked the local attorney general, and she said the same thing. And then I made friends with an FBI agent whose office is in Brunswick, Georgia, and I can't tell you where it is because I'm sworn to secrecy, but he has an office in Brunswick, Georgia. And I said to him, what's the story? And he said the same thing. He said, we don't know how to find it, and we don't know how to see it. Because what happens in our small communities is that it goes on, but who are you going to tell? Even if my town isn't sprawling, isn't this space that Vivian has described where you're 100 miles until you see the next house. It's actually it's a city, right? Small city. But if you stand up and you say, oh my God, your uncle paid for sex with me, a 14-year-old girl last night, who's ever going to believe that 14-year-old girl? And where is she going to go? Right? Where is she going to be safe? So because these spaces are small, there are all kinds of challenges for just finding out that it's going on. And it's not like a ginormous traffic ring. You'll have somebody who's trafficking 2 people. So it's not, it looks different in these smaller spaces. To take a different approach from what Raleigh was saying about talking about victims and how we respond to the vulnerable in society, I do a lot of talking about the demand side, right? There's supply, which is Raleigh is talking about, and I want to talk about demand for a second. So I stood up in a congregation in Atlanta, Georgia, in a room full of white, middle, and upper middle class families, 50-50 men and women, let's say, and I said, this is what the Johns look like. These are who's buying sex with young girls. So if it's you, and if it's not you, then it's your friends, which was the scariest thing I think I've ever done, right? I was like, and please don't fire me. Thank you very much. It's a scary thing to say, and so saying things like that is another piece that we can do. And when we talk about education and how we respond to it, when we educate in our schools, when we educate our students, our middle school and elementary school and our high school children, we don't want to just educate our girls about how to not be vulnerable. We want to educate our boys about how to not exploit people. Don't pay for sex with people, right? Making that part of the message is a really important piece. Putting an end to the demand side is also a critical piece of our work within a faith-based context for things that we can do to respond. And then also to echo what Raleigh was saying, watch for vulnerable people, right? As communities, as faith-based communities, we get to see our small collection of people really look after our people and train ourselves to really look for who's not there, right? It's the hardest thing to do. We don't look for who doesn't show up. That's really, really tough, but that's really the task at hand. Thank you.
It's really important to see people because when we don't look into the eyes of the other, it's very easy to not notice those who are around us. I often think about the subway and how everybody kind of looks down, right? And last week we read in a Torah portion about how it's supposed to be if you see something, you're supposed to say something. And it's really hard to say something if you haven't seen the other. And so how important is that message? And thank you. We are going to turn to Reverend Joan Hubricks, who I actually got to meet a couple of years ago when we began working on our interfaith toolkit with UNICEF USA. I also see Father Brian McWeeny here, who is also part of that toolkit, so thank you, Brian. That toolkit is actually available for you. We have those handouts, and we also have our End Trafficking Fellows from UNICEF USA who are in the room, and certainly, can you just raise your hand for a sec? Okay, you see 1 and 2 in the back. They'll also be collecting your Q&A cards, but they're also here to be a resource if you want to talk to them about possibly using the toolkit, which is actually also available right on the UNICEF USA website, unicefusa.org/interfaith toolkit, if I remember correctly. And they also have a domestic version as well as a global version. So just because you're not from the US doesn't mean you can't take a look and find something useful in there. But Reverend Joan, you were amazing in working on that toolkit with us, and you've been doing some really interesting work. Reverend Hubers is a Zen teacher in the lineage of the White Plum Ashtanga, right? And you are based in New Jersey, and also you are a psychotherapist. So you have a very unique perspective, and you work with an organization working with trafficking victims in Newark. Those flyers are also available outside. We made those available for you as well. So I'm going to let Joan talk a little bit about her experience, and thank you.
Well, welcome, everybody. It's very gratifying to see so much interest in this particular topic, which is a really important topic for our society, and it's a place where we often turn a blind eye. People don't really want to look at trafficking, and they don't want to know a lot about it. So thank you all for coming and listening to us talk about it. I have two jobs. I am a clinical social worker, and I'm a Zen teacher, and I lead a community in Ridgewood, New Jersey. And some years ago, about 10 years ago, I was in Thailand for a Buddhist event, and I was struck on the beaches by all the elderly white men with 16-year-old girls strolling around on the beaches, and it was really striking and very disturbing to me. So I came back from that trip interested in the problem and began to give talks about the magnitude of it in my Zen world, to Buddhist communities. And then out of the blue, I got an email from a colleague who was in Washington asking if I knew anybody that would be interested, any clinical social workers who might be interested in volunteering some time to work with an agency in Newark who was working with survivors of trafficking. And I thought, gosh, that's exactly what I'm looking for. So I hopped right on that and formed a relationship with this agency now 8 years ago. And it's been really interesting work, and I want to share with you a couple of, so I serve that community, that agency now in two capacities. One, I supervise their clinicians, and I serve on the board. And I want to come back to that agency in a moment. They're a wonderful agency, and they're doing great work in Newark, and there are other agencies like them. So one thing I want to suggest to any of you that are faith-based and looking for ways to get involved in this enormous problem, which seems very intimidating when you first start to think of how can I help, one way to help is to volunteer with agencies that are already established and serving this population. The second thing I do is, as a leader of this Zen community, our community was invited 2 years ago to provide some Buddhist teachings to a local prison. The name of the prison is Avondale Prison in New Jersey, and they specialize in incarcerating sex offenders and perpetrators. And they have 700 men, all men, who are in fact perpetrators. So we agreed to do that and felt incredibly challenged by it because we had no idea what a room full of sex offenders would feel like to be in. But it has been incredibly gratifying. The men that are seeking Buddhist teachings are already at sort of the highest level of the process. This is a treatment facility, and they get treatment 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, and most of them are incarcerated for 7 years or longer. So they get a lot of processing. So when we meet with them, they are mostly very remorseful, committed to changing their lives and leading a life that is spiritually based, and interested in any help we can provide them with living a life that has integrity and value. So that's the other side of the equation. And I wanted to paint a picture of what these vulnerable people are, just based on a couple of young women that I worked with. First of all, they are usually really young when they get picked up for trafficking. We're talking about 13, 14 is typical, some as young as 11, and in some countries, they're not even in puberty yet. So it's a very heartbreaking life. So I want to tell you the story of two girls. One was 19 when I met her. She was from Oklahoma, and she had a family that neglected her. Her mother was very busy working, and she had a boyfriend and wasn't around much, and the 19-year-old really was on her own for the most part. She had won a scholarship, cheerleading scholarship, to college. So she was really launched and had a break there. But she got in trouble in college. She was raped. That was the first problem. Secondly, she was drinking and got kicked off the cheerleading squad, was seen drinking, lost her scholarship, and that was the end of college. So she was really lost and vulnerable. And some guy made friends with her and treated her like a princess, bought her gifts, told her how wonderful she was, how smart, how beautiful, and said he had a great job for her, but she'd have to come to New Jersey. So she had nothing else going on in her life at that moment, and she agreed to come to New Jersey. And so he drove her to New Jersey, where she had no friends, no contacts, didn't know anybody, and he became her pimp. So luckily, one of her Johns was an undercover cop and recognized her as probably being underage, and got her out and into treatment, and that's where I met her. So I just have 1 minute to go, so I'm not going to tell you the second story, but it's somewhat similar, except in this case it was a local girl from Newark who was 15 when I met her and had also been raped and sexually abused from childhood and had no home to go to. She was essentially homeless. So she also ended up trafficked and was in fact found by an undercover cop in the same manner. So the law enforcement is incredibly important in this whole picture. So the agency that I work with now does post-trauma work. They do trauma work for women that come out of traffic situations. And they set them on a path that hopefully will allow them to have a life that won't take them back into a trafficking situation. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Joan. Truly, I grew up in New Jersey, and so some of those areas are quite familiar to me. And I am so grateful for the work that you are doing there, because not only are the victims from perhaps New Jersey, but certainly from elsewhere as well. I'm sure that young woman who came to New Jersey was from some other part of the country, yes?
One was from Oklahoma, the other was in Newark.
Okay. So certainly, this is a problem that not only starts in urban areas, but often starts elsewhere, and people come towards urban areas as well. Our last panelist is Alicia Weber, who I actually had the privilege of meeting at lunch before our session, although we have been talking for a little while about the work that she is doing in Nebraska. Anybody here ever been to Nebraska? Oh, we have a nice handful of people from Nebraska. Are you from Nebraska? Nope. So we do have some visitors from Nebraska who have been through Nebraska, but the work that Alicia's been working on there is she's the program director for the Salvation Army's Fight to End Trafficking, known as SAFE-T, which I thought was really great. And she's also the coordinator of services with the Nebraska Human Trafficking Task Force. So you're working a lot with the Attorney General, correct?
Yes.
And so there are some unique challenges, I think, to working in such an area. And your program's what, the current safety program's about a year old?
We've been serving survivors for a year and a half now.
Okay. So there's lots of unique aspects that she's going to share with us and help enlighten us to what's going on the western side of our country. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, we're not Western. We're like right in the center of Nebraska. Just
Mississippi.
yeah, right? We are what's known as flyover country. And so just to give you a little idea of what Nebraska looks like, I actually was educating myself on the way over here. So Omaha, Nebraska's population is actually 1.9 million people in all of Nebraska. And we have about 77,000 square miles, so we're rather large with not a lot of people. And if you talk to law enforcement in particular out in some of our least populous counties, they'll tell you there are more cows than people. And in Omaha and Lincoln, which are our two largest cities, I'm from Omaha, so I'm from the big city, 400,000 people. And then Lincoln also has about 2,500 people. So that leaves the rest of the state, 91 counties, with about 1.2 million people, so quite spread out. It takes about 6 to 7 hours to drive across the state if you don't stop and are using the interstate. So as we were talking about, transportation is a huge issue for people who are seeking services. I started this work about 5 years ago, actually, with the Salvation Army's Wellspring program, serving survivors of prostitution. They'd been involved in this program for about 20 years at this point. And so as I was sitting listening to the stories of some of the women they were working with, they were all women at the time, but they served men as well. I recognized that most of these women had been turned out by the time they were 13 or 14 years old, which means we were actually serving survivors of trafficking. So I barely knew that prostitution existed in Omaha when I first started, and now we're saying, oh my gosh, trafficking happens in Omaha. So the rest of the state, as it turns out, is quite in the same boat of if prostitution or sex trafficking is happening in Nebraska, it's happening in Omaha, it's happening in the big city, right? Fast forward a couple years later, the Nebraska Human Trafficking Task Force was commissioned in October of 2015. We received a federal grant from the Office for Victims of Crime and the Bureau of Justice Assistance to form with the Nebraska Attorney General's Office, the Nebraska Human Trafficking Task Force. So the Nebraska Attorney General's Office leads the law enforcement and prosecution side, and we're working to coordinate services in Nebraska as the Salvation Army. We also started partnering with the Creighton's Human Trafficking Initiative, funded by the Women's Fund of Omaha, which found through their research, they've been scraping back page ads for the last year and a half, 2 years at this point. They've found there are 900 unique individuals being sold online in Nebraska every month. We are missing it. About 650 of those are in the Omaha-Lincoln area, but the rest is outstate. So even in one of the smallest places that's advertised online, they're seeing at least 30 people a month being advertised, again, just online on this one website. So we have no idea what this looks like word of mouth. We have no idea what this looks like as far as labor trafficking, except for our anecdotal evidence. But we know it's a huge problem. Part of that is the transportation factor. We have a major interstate. We also have a few highways that are known for drug trafficking, and usually where there are drugs, there is sex trafficking. So we know we have a big problem. And luckily, we have this amazing task force of people who are really trying to take a look at this from every angle, whenever their sphere of reference is. So we have people like the Department of Health and Human Services on board. We've got members of the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Coalition. We've got people from the Child Advocacy Centers on board, because as we're working through this issue and what this looks like for our state, we're noticing, we knew it, but it continues to get reinforced that any step forward we take, if we're missing a system or we're missing a discipline or we're missing a community, we actually haven't moved forward at all. So we're moving very slowly and very methodically, and there's a reason for that. It's because we are really looking at cultural change. And how do you make cultural change? It's through relationships, right? And it's through building that awareness piece at this point is kind of where we're at. Also, I have found, too, with law enforcement, as a service provider who didn't work with law enforcement very often, law enforcement is like our biggest champion. The Nebraska State Patrol is not receiving a single dollar to help us in this, and yet they're taking this on and just putting a massive amount of resources into it, because their people are on the ground and are seeing this daily. And they keep saying we had no idea what to do, and we didn't know where to take them. So now they know what to do, most of them. We're still working on training. And they know where to take them, because at the very least they have the Salvation Army's phone number, and we're coordinating services and helping with that safety net for survivors of trafficking. So again, we originally formed in October of 2015. It's federal funding, so we actually didn't see the money until February of 2016. But we are full steam ahead. It's been about a year, and we are now doing proactive investigations where, quite frankly, any single time we go fishing, we post an ad, there are very quick responses for people to purchase. So again, reinforcing just how much of an issue this is in Nebraska. And the safety program itself, we are tasked with a number of different things. One of the things we do, though, is we are coordinating wraparound services for survivors of human trafficking, both sex and labor. We have served 61 people just in 2017 alone, and that's with not a whole lot of people knowing who we are and what exactly it is we do. People are coming out of the woodwork to come get services. So we provide case coordination in places like Omaha and Lincoln, where there are quite a few services available. But as you move farther out, the services are fewer and much less specialized. A lot of them are doing a lot of different things. So we end up being the case manager in a lot of instances as well, working with people one-on-one, weekly, every other day, just kind of depending on the level of need of survivors. And one thing that we have noticed too, which is not a surprise, but out of the 61 survivors we served last year, most were women, most had been sex trafficked, all are lawful permanent residents of the United States. They were born here, they live here. Many people did not actually move from Omaha and Lincoln, they were mostly trafficked in Omaha and Lincoln. When you start moving out west, there's a lot more driving that happens, a lot more circuits that happen to keep the market fresh, and also just because we know that the likelihood of being caught in a smaller community is a little higher if you stay there much longer. We also know that almost every single individual we served had prior childhood trauma. These were kids who were missed and now are coming to us in their 20s and 30s, right? So what were the protective factors? Where were the protective parents? Where was that community to really help them? So again, just recognizing, that human trafficking really does thrive in the darkness and the isolation. And if we're not connecting with each other as professionals, as multidisciplinary teams, as faith communities, regardless of your faith, we're never going to make a dent in this, because this is how it happens. Traffickers expect people to be afraid to reach out. They're counting on it. And even when they do reach out, they expect the community not to respond. So let's change that script.
Thank you. I have so many questions. The Board of Rabbis has been doing the work with UNICEF USA now since, I think, 2010. Rachel, is that right? I think 2010. And we are most proud of that relationship. And in 2015, we started partnering a great deal with Arigato International, one of our other co-sponsors. Arigato International, if you don't know them, they're a global NGO. They're based out of Tokyo with offices here in New York, Geneva, and in Nairobi as well. And they also convene the Global Network of Religions for Children. So if you live somewhere else around the world, you may have a GNRC group already working. As well as they also spearhead the Day of Prayer and Action for Children, which focuses on November 20th, which is the World Day of the Child. And certainly to find out more information about that, Rebecca Rios-Cohn is their New York director, is here with us as well, and Eileen is sitting over there, who I got to meet earlier today. So we all have been working so much on child protection issues, as well as looking at the big issue of trafficking, which oftentimes, as I keep hearing across the panel, starts often when children are in their early tween into teen years. This is something that when these kids are still living at home by and large, they're with us. And so we also know that trafficking now today in the world is right up there with the trade of arms and drugs. We're trading people. And one of the things that we hear often from traffickers is that they would rather trade in people because you can resell a person over and over and over again. And that's terrifying. To think that these are our neighbors and our friends and our children, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, wherever we go, there is a point of connection. And to change the course and the continued growth of this industry, we need to implement strategies to create change, real change. And across this table, I'm hearing a lot of people creating change, working towards change. My question to you all is, does anybody have any best practices for coordinating with law enforcement? Somebody once said to me that, oh, faith communities don't need to be involved in this issue. Just leave it to law enforcement. And we know that if I talk to somebody, like somebody I was on a panel with a number of years ago from Interpol, he said, we pull out about 2 kids a week. That's Interpol. 2 kids a week. We have to be doing better because we have to start preventing more. So what are your best strategies?
One thing that we've noticed is as we help faith communities focus on vulnerability first and then look for red flags, we're seeing people kind of come out of the woodwork. One of our churches that was partnered with us in our pilot project about 4 years ago when we decided to go this direction, they're in Ridgewood, Queens, and they identified those who were most vulnerable in the community as new immigrants, and so they did a clothing drive. They were giving away coats, and they met a young woman from Central Asia. She had just moved into the city, and as the pastor was talking with this young woman, they both understood about every 5th word that the other was saying, but as they were talking, the pastor was like, please, come here. And she goes, I might be able to come to this church because I'm working right down the street. Well, a month passes, and people in this pastor's congregation come up to him and they say, hey, there's a brothel on our community Facebook page. So he, being a well-meaning guy, clicks on the link in front of all his parishioners, which I'm sure was very awkward. And as he clicks on this link, he sees the face of the woman to whom he gave a coat. He calls me. He's panicked. He's like, what do we do? And I said, this is where we have to partner with local law enforcement. And I said, call your local precinct. I'll help you however we can, but just start a conversation. And that's what they did. This conversation led to this police chief realizing, wow, they actually want to partner with us, kind of like what you were experiencing. And he started parking a police car right in front of this illicit massage parlor. He's like, if it's an illicit massage parlor, we're going to shut down their business. If it's on the up and up, they're going to be fine. They're just going to have to walk around. And so what happened was that one incident led to the shutting down of 27 illicit massage parlors in Ridgewood, Queens. I actually heard about this story from someone else. I ran into someone in Midtown, and they're like, you know, I was getting coffee, and this guy was talking in the coffee shop in Ridgewood, and he was like, I can't buy sex here anymore. I got to go to the next neighborhood. And she's like, did you know about this? And I'm like, yeah, I heard something about it. You know, it was just a really exciting thing because this wasn't rocket surgery. They were focused on the vulnerable people in front of them. And they just kept pulling that thread, and they involved local law enforcement. And I don't believe there are any brothels currently in Ridgewood because of one church's vigilance and their collaboration with local law enforcement.
I, I love those stories of success. They're fantastic and they're very inspiring. I do think that in most cases, though, collaboration can take time. And here you have the really fortunate situation that there was an identifiable victim, there was a situation, and folks came together. Sometimes it doesn't always work that way, and so especially where you have small communities that have been discussed, where everyone knows one another, when you're bringing folks from across a state or a region together, it can take time to build that trust. And so I would say that coming together before you have an event already planned or before a problem has arisen is probably the best way to approach with an open mind and with great humility, being open to hearing also I think some of the challenges that law enforcement faces, and they are often not, I would say, always heard. And so to come together with an open mind and humility to talk to them. You've heard from other speakers here today talk about a multidisciplinary approach, different professionals coming together to attack to combat human trafficking from the perspective of both ending demand but also providing services to victims. Same thing, when you're pulling together, whether it's a domestic violence agency or a sexual assault coalition or law enforcement, to really come together and build some trust and to have meetings, to get to know one another and to really build that trusting relationship in order to have a productive collaboration.
I'll say too, it's kind of like building any new relationship. I might have in the back of my head what I want you to do, but when I first meet you, I'm going to ask what I can do for you, right? And I'm probably going to bring donuts, which is like super stereotypical, but seriously, they appreciate that. And have conversations about how it looks in their community and how they are responding. And if they're not responding, how can we help them get additional resources or something like that? I think just sparking that first conversation, because really law enforcement is concerned. They are, but this is so resource intensive. I mean, we have, sheriff's offices who have like 2 deputies for a very large region. So that creates issues. One of the things that we did in Nebraska is we started regional task forces because we knew the statewide task force would be viewed as Omaha and Lincoln telling everybody else how to do it, which is sometimes like the feds swooping in and taking over, right? So it's really helping build coalition, helping build task forces, finding the champions who are really excited about this and letting them talk to the other law enforcement officers too, giving them the tools they need to really be the change makers in their own agency is really helpful.
So SANAR, S-A-N-A-R, is the agency that I work with in Newark. And their strategy has been to give educational presentations to law enforcement. Now, unlike Lincoln and Omaha, we have a lot of police stations in Newark. So they are mostly very receptive, and then they have an understanding of what trafficking is, because there's an amazing amount of ignorance on the part of law enforcement about how it works and how it's done and how to find them. And so these presentations, which are given by our trafficking experts, are very well received, and in the context of doing that, they build the relationships with local law enforcement.
So my next question is kind of double-sided. One, we talk about how do we protect victims or potential victims, prevention side. And prevention comes in 2 forms. One, we need to prevent our children from being taken into this world. And second, we have to make sure that we end the demand. Demand is probably the biggest part of the problem, I would say. Wherever there's demand, somehow in our world, human beings find the way to bring the supply. And that's a very sad statement. So if you're working on the prevention side of working with youth or this prevention side of working to end demand, please tell me, share with all of us your strategies.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just really struck by, Raleigh, he talked about vulnerability and embracing folks who are vulnerable. And I just think, in my mind, I thought right away about a community in which a single mother, can't put food on the table. She's trying to work, but she can't find childcare. And how could we come in as a community and support her? Because she is vulnerable to trafficking, and her 8-year-old kid who needs childcare is vulnerable to trafficking, right? We know that. And so whether it's a food pantry or childcare or GED, continuing education assistance or job training, whatever it is that can wrap around and help support that person in our community, that is prevention. The second thing that I thought about, Rachel had mentioned talking to this group of people about demand and saying, sitting next to you, could be, I kind of imagined, sitting next to you could be someone who's paid for sex, right? Well, sitting next to you could also be someone who has really, really cheap labor that's cleaning their office, that's cleaning their building, or that's picking fruit, in their business if they're in the farming business, right? So to really think about, I think, how to end demand in terms of awareness and education, and making sure that people are not buying sex, but also where we all accept that services or products are super cheap, we're playing a role. Because every dollar that we save is off the backs of somebody who's been sold, right? And so really thinking about, how do we end demand beyond, in addition to ending the buying of sex and the buying of people?
To a certain extent, that question is a spiritual question. How do we shut down demand for sex that's going to harm somebody? And there's an awful lot of people that are unchurched, and it feels a little hopeless there. But they're not all unchurched. And so raising that standard of not harming others is something that those of us who are in churches of one sort or another really can raise. It's a very important issue.
Many of us would agree that we would agree to a principle of loving our neighbor. And in so doing, we can combat human trafficking. But I think the best way to see this is we need to love the neighbor that we see, as well as the neighbor that we don't see. We need to love that neighbor who's vulnerable in front of us, whether it be someone who's homeless or someone who's in the foster system or someone who is a recent immigrant, regardless of their documentation status. We need to love that person because they are at risk of exploitation. But we should also love the person who's creating the products that we consume, who's creating the food, who's producing the food, the clothing that we wear. It's interesting. I was just speaking to a group of students last week, and I said, when you go to the grocery store, who here looks at labels? We're all about looking at nutritional labels as long as they benefit us, but we don't think to look for labels that may benefit others. And so when we think of fair trade or direct trade, these are basically certifications and, in a sense, promises that say that the people that produce these goods are being paid fair wages. We have to start thinking, are we purchasing freedom or are we consuming suffering?
I'm going to ask my last question, but I'm going to see if you have any questions. If you have an index card and you would like for Eitan or for Hannah to come by and pick it up, if you need an index card, they can bring one to you at your seat. Just hold up your hand and let them know. I see some people need some cards over here on this side of the aisle, as well as on the other side. We've got some other folks who are looking for cards. Trafficking is an equal opportunity destroyer. We often think that it happens to someone else, someplace else, something that we don't even know. And so much of what we're starting to talk about in our society is when somebody sees something on the news. Oh, they just broke up a trafficking ring in whatever the place is. And it splashes across the TV screen or on the front page of the paper, and then tomorrow we're not talking about it anymore. And so as a rabbi, I remember as a congregational rabbi, making sure that this was something that we were talking about over and over and over again, having pamphlets to hand out, engaging people in community, teaching this to our students, teaching this to our adults. I remember when I was in a congregation in New Jersey, and I was asked to come and speak at a panel at the New York Board of Rabbis on domestic violence. After that, Rabbi Joe Potasnik, who happens to be here, he's our executive vice president, he had the vision to say, we need to do more. We have to train rabbis, we have to train community members on how do we address all of these issues: domestic violence, child abuse, elder abuse, trafficking, both sex and labor, online commercial sexual exploitation of kids. Our voices as a community have to be heard, and we have to uplift all those who are vulnerable amongst us. So my last question, and it's probably the hardest question I could ask, can any of us give an example of a community that saw the successful reduction or elimination of trafficking? And what, if anything, would be an element of the success? Oh boy. That means we have a lot of work to do. If we have any questions that have been handed in, we could bring those to the front. I'll take a look at some of those cards. I think one of the challenges that we always have is trying to figure out how we're going to handle these issues. How do we talk about them from the pulpit? How do we get our sisterhood, our brotherhood, our children's ministries, our youth leaders talking about these issues? And those are universal problems. As I'm waiting for the cards to come up, I'm going to ask Rebecca. She said she has a question.
Thank you very much. My question is to you, faith leaders. Do you think it is possible to convince faith leaders to do more from their pulpits, from their houses of worship? And what does it take to have a faith leader agree to do that? I don't think it's that common. I think there are champions out there that are willing to address this issue. But from your perspective, what would it take to get this to be a much more common occurrence? Thank you.
Yeah. I'll jump in. The first thing I think it takes is asking. I think common to what we've heard in some of Diana's questions is that the need to raise awareness is so huge, right? Raise awareness within the law enforcement community about what trafficking looks like, sex and labor trafficking. Raise awareness within our congregations about what trafficking looks like, who's buying, who's being sold, who's doing the buying, and all of those things. And to just point it out to people is often incredibly powerful. When I was in Atlanta, I pushed this big educational initiative within the Jewish community there. And I just went to the rabbis around town and said, I want to do this day program. But we had this big program, and we had all these people from all over the greater Atlanta area come together. And I just said, will you come do this? And then I asked if they would let me come and talk at their synagogues, or if they would talk at their synagogues, or if I had a program, would they do it? And people just said yes. I mean, I didn't find that there was resistance there. It was just a matter of saying, this is the information, here's what you need to know, now please stand up and tell it. And the truth is that, once you hear these stories, I mean, I'm imagining most of you walked in here because you know a little bit about trafficking, but when you sit down with somebody who's never heard about trafficking before and you explain what this looks like, I find that the response is always shock and horror and disgust and, oh my God, how can I make that not happen? Because it's so horrifying in the world. So, I found that people are willing to get involved, and I think it's beyond faith leaders, right? It's also saying to everybody here, go tell 10 of your friends something that you learned today about human trafficking, how powerful and impactful that can be as well.
When I was in seminary, I remember saying, I believe the Bible, and that's why I don't do social justice. And it's kind of embarrassing now, honestly, because now as I read the Bible, all I see are acts of justice and mercy from the people of God, like loving the people in front of them. And I think many congregations, oftentimes, they miss this focus in their holy books. They miss this focus that is woven into the tapestry of their belief system. And to have them teach it from the pulpit, and this is what we encourage with Let My People Go. We say, once you identify a vulnerable population, preach on this. Show people that these people have just as much dignity as you do, and you may not be helping them as much as they're going to help you. Be partner with these people, see them as equals. And what we find is when they preach messages like this, the people are more apt to see it. And I think this works regardless of your faith perspective.
I have a lot of really good questions up here. So I'm going to take a moment to address one of them that I think was really important just to start from, to learn the facts. How are you going, because human trafficking and exploitation thrives in an environment of denial and fear. So what is the working definition of human trafficking? The United Nations defines human trafficking in 2 very long sentences that hinge on the word exploitation. The definition has 2 parts, and here they are. The act, what is done, recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons. The means, how it is done, threat or use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, or vulnerability, or giving payments or benefits to a person in control of the victim. The purpose, why it is done, for the purpose of exploitation, which includes exploiting the prostitution of others, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, or similar practices, and the removal of organs. The American government in 2000, Trafficking Victims Protection Act, defined human trafficking as the following: sex trafficking in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained the age of 18. And second, the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt, bondage, or slavery. And a person does not have to leave their hometown, as we have heard, in order to be a victim of trafficking. So that's a working definition for us, as some people have asked for that information.
And state laws vary.
And state laws do vary across the country, as well as we have the UN has a working definition. It does change a little bit from country to country how they identify. With all of your questions, I'm going to start with the following because it's very interesting because it came up in 3 of the questions. Was the question of pornography, the issue of pornography. What more can we do to stop pornography? Is pornography related to human trafficking? If so, to what degree? And the second, which I think really connects, is looking at perpetrators. What is the role of pornography in addiction, addicting these men to, and what role does it play in moving these men to harm young girls? So there is, sometimes through for pornography, we do see an uptick in the amount of harm, physical harm to their future victims. So if anybody would like to talk about the issue and prevalence of pornography and how that intersects with human trafficking.
I'll take a shot at it, although I haven't done the research on it. I think the most consistent predictor of predation, of becoming a predator, is being sexually abused themselves as a child. And it really seems to be very consistent that somebody who is a predator has been abused themselves. So I haven't seen any research that says that pornography alone is likely to lead to becoming a predator.
Recently, I was talking to a man who runs another organization focused primarily on millennials, and he was not coming from a faith perspective. And as we were talking, he said, "Oh, well, you're trying to get people to fight human trafficking. What is your stance on pornography?" And we started talking about it, and he said, "Here's the deal." He's like, "I've been kind of like trying to do a reboot where I don't look at porn." And he's like, "What I found is when I don't look at porn, I see people differently. They're less objects and they're more people, and I'm willing to hear them." And I think one of the ways that pornography folds itself into this movement of trafficking, one, is that 20% of all pornographic images that you will find online are of those under the age of 18. Two, most pornography, it's not just basic like lovemaking. This is sex and violence, it's distortion, it's whatever can happen to get someone to reach that point of climax. And so at the end of the day, it's shaping people's minds, not only how they will act out sexually, but it's shaping how they will act out socially and their senses of humor and everything. And so it's very intricately tied into human trafficking. One thing we used to say a lot was, not everyone who's in pornography has been trafficked, but almost everyone who's been trafficked for sex has probably been in pornography. And most of my friends who have been trafficked for sex will say that there was a tape made of them and a sex buyer, and it was used to coerce them. Or, I mean, one month I got like 3 or 4 different calls from people saying, hey, this young lady we're working with, her ex-boyfriend, pimp, just uploaded something online. How do we get this off the web? And this is something real. The person that you're watching may not be there by choice.
There's some pieces here about how visualization creates, moves you to actualization. So the things that you see become the things that you do, right? We know there's a lot of psychological research about these things. Looking at the role of pornography, and I think there's some room here to have include in the conversation around human trafficking, sex trafficking, and pornography, also a conversation about prostitution, right? The difference between prostitution and trafficking, marginal as it may be, but it exists, right? That force, fraud, and coercion phrase that we just heard repeatedly is really important. There's some great research out there from CASE, the Chicago Area Alliance on Sexual Exploitation, on the buyers and why they pay for sex. And so it's complicated, right? Complicated to understand the motivation of who's paying for sex and why, and some of it is about wanting to act out these sort of extraordinary sexual, fantasies, and some of that's got to come from what you see in porn. But some of it is, whatever, it's a different conversation. But I think it depends. I think it depends, right? And it's complicated because I don't want to come across being like pro-prostitution or pro-pornography. I just want to say that it's really complicated, and teasing apart all the different aspects of the issues and what makes all the things happen when trafficking is happening is complicated. That's all.
Just ditto on CASE. It's the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation. They're a really wonderful resource based in Chicago. The other person who's an expert on issues of pornography is Gail Dines, who's can be controversial. My read of this is that the pornography that is often paraded around when we talk about the First Amendment in this country is like the tip of the iceberg, is really not most pornography. Most pornography is just incredibly misogynistic and violent, as Raleigh mentioned, and also focuses on children. The overlap with buyers' use of pornography in terms of the exploitation and the trafficking, in terms of sex trafficking and the exploitation of women is just a huge, huge overlap. So. And I think also going back to something that Rachel mentioned in her first, when she first addressed all of us, which is the objectification of human beings, and how the more that we dehumanize people and we turn them into objects, and they are so violently turned into objects within the context of pornography, the easier it is to just accept slavery and trafficking as part of our culture and our community. So to me, they're just inextricably connected, and there's such huge overlap there. It's, to me, I think it's really a false argument to try to defend pornography.
Yeah.
But.
And I think we could probably continue to talk about pornography for a very long time, because it is a very complicated conversation. There's so many good questions. I'm going to try and couple some together that have common themes. If you have additional questions and we don't get to them, we are going to actually put together a Google Doc for your questions, and we will do our best to answer them afterwards. So we will take the ones that we don't get to today, but if we have additional ones, please feel free, give us your email or your business card. We will send you the link to the Google Doc so you'll have all of our answers, and we'll also draw one out later, and somebody will get a book from UNICEF USA from Carol Stern. So it's actually a great book. I Believe in Zero. So the next question actually comes from somebody in New Jersey who works with the New Jersey Attorney General's Human Trafficking Task Force. So she says, thank you for bringing up this demand side and talks about some of the statistics about 24.9 million of victims since it's a $150 billion industry, as we all know. We must discuss the demand side. With that, faith-based leaders, what is our role in teaching anti-demand, working with law enforcement to understand the support for victims, and as well as talking about forced marriage, and the use of training for those involved in businesses, especially hospitality and healthcare. And just to shout out for New Jersey, that they have made it mandatory for state police and hotel, motel, as well as healthcare facilities to do the training in collaboration with the FBI, state police, Department of Labor and Consumer Affairs, which is really wonderful. And to couple that together with that work, anybody here working with schools, teaching and education in schools, and anything else we might be able to do to prevent trafficking, what are the signs we can look for? And if you have time for that, how do we stop the buyers?
I'll talk about schools. Anyone else want to talk about schools? So I tried to get involved in doing education around schools, and I'm in Georgia, so let me just be clear about Georgia and educating about anything around sex in schools in Georgia, right? In order to, in my state, in order to change the curriculum around sex ed, which would be the place that you would likely have a conversation around the buying and selling of sex, you have to actually do it through the legislative process. And in the legislative work that I've done around human trafficking and domestic violence work, you don't ever want to touch the sex ed curriculum in Georgia, and probably other states as well, because any progress that we've made in Georgia in being able to educate about sex at all, right, that we can even say the word sex and Georgia in the same sentence, is like a big deal. And if you open up the code, if you put a piece of legislation out there, then the whole legislation that exists becomes vulnerable to other people pulling it back. And so the way to go about doing education in my community, which I don't think is necessarily true in the Northeast, I'm from the Northeast, so I say that with some sense of what it was like for me growing up. But where I am, I wouldn't do it through the school system. If I were going to do an education program, I would do it through faith-based communities. I would do it through after-school programs. That's an easier win, although still a very, very hard win to do. I just think through school systems, it's impossible. But through faith communities or after-school activities or the Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts maybe even. I mean, I haven't done a lot of work in trying. I started a little bit of efforts with the faith community in trying to educate our boys, middle school boys. I wanted to do something with middle school boys and couldn't get much traction on that. But just know when you try to do education in school systems, there is a legal piece to it, and that can be really tricky. Also, when you do stuff around education for yourself and learning about your communities, look at the legislation that's out there. Sometimes there's things to do to change the laws just locally that can make a big difference. What are the availability of services for victims? What's being put in place to make sure that our law enforcement are well educated, and so forth and so on. Those are some powerful places that you can be an advocate beyond just talking to people.
I'd just like to say that I would love the schools to teach about both sides of this, the problems with wanting to pay for sex, talking about that to adolescent boys, and what's on the other side of the transaction, what that person has gone through, that woman has gone through. And also to young girls who are 12, 13, 14, have no idea that this whole industry exists. So I think it's incredibly important and incredibly difficult. I haven't really tried to make inroads on it, but I would sure like to see it done.
The next question actually comes from somebody who is not from the U.S. and comes from a neighboring country. And she said, I really like the way you're addressing this problem because it is an invisible thing. Just because we say it out loud seems to bring shame and make others people uncomfortable. The question is, what is the role of the family in addressing human trafficking?
Huge. I mean, really, all the kids that I have had any direct contact with come from broken homes, troubled homes. One child who was 13 was, her mother refused to feed her because she was on punishment. And so the 13-year-old left the house and went to live with a boyfriend, and then another boyfriend, and then another boyfriend, until she ended up trafficked. So every single case I know of is a family problem.
I'll say too, when working with survivors of sex trafficking particularly, I always feel that they're looking for a sense of belonging, right? And that really comes from the family of origin, right? So I don't know, people are messy, families are messy, and I don't think that families, I think every family causes harm, right? Like, you don't mean to, everybody, you all love each other, but, there are things outside of our control, right? So I don't think it's just the role of the family, but I think it's other families helping other families and helping to create a protective environment where kids can thrive and don't have to worry about some of these things. But really, again, that sense of belonging is so huge. Peer pressure is real. And that's where we see a lot of kids getting swept up into this is different influences and those peer pressures. So really building a lot of protective factors around that and being able to have open conversations. I think sometimes kids get in too deep and they're too afraid to talk to their parents about what's happening. And so they continue to go along with it because they're afraid of repercussions from the family. So being able to have those open and honest conversations with parents or with another protective adult is really important too.
I think that we're hearing from people who are here trying to lift up communities that will support families, but since this question came from someone who's outside the United States, we really don't care about families in this country. We are ripping families apart, right, based on whether they have documentation or not. We don't support parental leave policies that allow for new parents to stay home with their new babies, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, the laws that we have, how they're implemented, how they're enforced right now, are not supportive of families. Right? So when I talk about that single mother who can't get childcare, who can't put food on the table, right, because of economic policies that we have in this country, we do not support families. And the only thing that is the counterbalance to that is some of what's been discussed here, which is that communities are coming together to support some of those families, but it's hard. It's very, very challenging. And so it's, I think that there's this sense when you come from the outside to this country, this idea that, this American family ideals thing that we put out there, it's not really the reality. It's incredibly hard for many families. And since today we're talking about rural areas, when you're incredibly isolated, when factories or other industries have left the area where you and your family have been for generations, and the economics plays a huge, huge role. How do we keep families together if it's safe and healthy for them to be together? How do we support them? And so there's a huge vacuum of need, and hopefully, today we're talking about faith communities stepping in to help support and help empower and help lift up those who are vulnerable to exploitation. But it's incredibly challenging.
Okay. Raleigh, you had spoken earlier about the brothel in, I'm reading here, the brothel in Brooklyn, Queens, Ridgewood. It's kind of on the border between the two boroughs. And you said that all these places were broken up and closed. The question is, were they just moved somewhere else or were they rescued? And the second part of that is, you've rescued a victim, you've prosecuted the perpetrator, now what? Send the victim back home? Change employments? How do we help?
That's a great question, because oftentimes I will hear with different faith communities, they'll say, we were praying over these places in our communities and they all went away. And that's where I ask the question, well, go online, find out if they moved. Did they change locations? You really need to think through this. There were rescues involved with these shutdowns, from what I understand, but oftentimes that doesn't happen. They do move. And I think the only way to address what to do when someone is rescued is to do it through collaboration. I was telling this story at lunch, how a gentleman came up to me. He was from Texas, and he was saying, hey man, I'm going to tell you what we did. We put a ladder up to the second floor of an illicit massage parlor. We got her out. Boy, we got her out. We saved her. What do you think? What do you think? And I just stopped, and I was like, that's the worst thing I could have ever heard today. That's literally the worst news I've heard all day. And he's like, what? And I'm like, he's like, but we got her out. And I'm like, but for how long? Like, is she connected to social services? Is there an aftercare? Is there a system of support that's able to come alongside of her? Is there someone there to try her case? Does she have legal services? All of the organizations that we represent, none of us do everything. We all focus on one swath and collaborate with others. And that's the only way to do this in a way that's actually holistic and actually blesses your community.
I have a 4-hour presentation on how to do services for survivors of trafficking, but I think ultimately it comes down to our mission, which our mission and our service philosophy were written in conjunction with working with survivors and informing on what this service program needs to look like. And really at the end of the day, our job is to empower people to find how they want to live their lives. Right? It's not Alicia Weber's decision on what their service plan looks like, because I have no idea what they've been through, even if they tell me, and I don't know where they're headed and where they want to go. It's all about providing options, reducing barriers, and allowing for survivor voice and choice, because this ultimately is a crime of power and control. So allowing people to get their voice back and really start making their own decisions for their lives and doing whatever you can to help facilitate that. That's really, at the end of the day, how we provide services, at least.
So I have gotten the sign from the back. It is time for us to conclude. I want to take a quick moment to say, for the questions we did not get to, we promise to put it together in a Google Doc. If you give us your information, we promise to get you answers. And I want to thank everybody for being here, to choosing to be part of this conversation, and for sharing your wonderful questions. I also wish to thank our panelists, Joan and Alicia, Raleigh, Rachel, and Vivian, for your wisdom and your incredible passion for this work. I thank you so much. To our partners at UNICEF USA, our End Trafficking Fellows who are here, who helped to make this happen, to Emma, to Rachel. You guys, Eitan and Hannah, you're amazing. Our partners are Arigato International, Rebecca Rios-Con, thank you so much. And to, of course, Rabbi Joe Potasnik, who I get the privilege of working with every day, for his vision and passion for all people. Thank you so much for coming.